Welcome to the Faithful and True podcast. We're happy to be back with you again today with two special guests, our director, Debbie Laaser, and Susie Smidt, one of our very talented counselors on staff here at Faithful and True, and of course our host, Dr. Greg Miller. Greg, we are surrounded by some very talented professionals today.
Yes, and if you remember, if you listened to us last week, we began talking about the stages of growth that couples go through. Jim Farm was with us, and we talked about stage 1 and some of the things that couples experience early in their recovery. Well, today, Deb and Susie and I are going to be talking about stage 2 for couples and some of the factors and some of the experiences that they have. And so, Susie and Deb, we're glad that you're with us.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, welcome.
Glad to be here.
Yes, it's always good.
Just to kind of begin with, Susie, what has been your experience just in general working with couples? Like, how do you experience that? And is that something that is meaningful for you? And what is it that you like about it?
Yeah, well, it's very meaningful for me to be able to, I always say this, to be a person in the lives of couples that I needed at that stage. There were those who were there like that for me at that time.
Right. And yeah, there is this piece where for all of us who are part of the recovery journey and worked on our marriages, where we're able to kind of cast a vision of hope just being with them.
Right.
And Deb, how was it for you and Mark as y'all began to first get involved working with couples?
Well, we always enjoyed that part, I think, because as a couple, our coupleship represented really any of the issues that were coming up from our couple. So, and it wasn't always male to male, female to female. It's just in our coupleship, we're a system. And being able to work with other couples and share some of our experiences seemed to always give them more hope and normalize, too, their life in many cases.
Yeah.
And I think one of the reasons I love looking at these stages of growth is because it helps us to know there's something more in this journey of recovery from sexual addiction that's more than just getting sober for our spouses. And that, to me, brings hope that wasn't the end all to our work with for ourselves or with the couples we were working with.
Well, and even these stages, I think, are important because it's easy, especially in our coupleship, to begin to believe, well, this is as good as it's going to be. You know, maybe we're not screaming anymore. Maybe there's not a lot of conflict. And so if we're not careful, we can become complacent and believe that that's all there is. And part of the work with couples is to really cast this vision that you can begin to thrive in your relationship. In an earlier podcast, I told the story of the first time Beth and I came to Faithful and True and saw you and Mark together. Just y'all's presence kind of offered an invitation to the journey and then also really cast a vision that you could just go beyond the surviving the chaos of the addiction to really thriving in your relationship. And I think that that's one of the things that we offer couples is this possibility that there is more if they are able and willing to choose the journey. So let's kind of look at stage 2. Like I said last time, we talked about stage 1, and we characterize this as a time to build and grow. And so the first thing is to accept that the addiction is a problem and not the problem. And I know that that's kind of the language of Virginia Satir. So what do we mean when we talk about that particular phrase?
Well, for me, it was easy to say that, to actually believe that every problem that I currently was facing was because of this explosion in our relationship. And what was true is that did bring a great deal of pain to me. And as I sat in my women's group and did my counseling, I realized that the roots of some of my habits, my ways of thinking, my beliefs were long, long, long before I ever got married to Russ.
And I think also when something is just a problem and not the problem, it doesn't put all the focus on just one person for being the problem for all the things that we're experiencing in life. That's an incredible amount of pressure.
Right.
and never feels good. None of us would like to believe that one thing we've done or are in our life has created so much pain around us that it will always be there, and it really creates a victim, I think, situation in the relationship, which is, again, not about growth or thriving. It's more about surviving.
Right.
And so I often think this sentence that Virginia Satir came up with is a little bit of a spoiler alert, you know what I mean, in terms of people that would like to have something to blame, perhaps, for all the reasons they aren't feeling good or feeling, devastated by something. And I don't mean to minimize the pain that comes out of some of our situations, especially addiction, because there is that part. And we've talked about in stage 1 how we need to hear that pain and trauma. And if we don't move on, though, we become victimized by that, and we really don't believe we have choices to grow and change and learn from the pain that we've been through.
Well, and I think this idea that the addiction is a symptom, that there's a deeper issue going on. A lot of times I use the idea of if there's a gas fire, you can keep trying to put the fire out and you may have limited success, but it's going to keep coming back until you figure out how to turn off the gas. And so when we're working with couples, the addiction does reveal a symptom. There's something greater going on, and we have to address that deeper wound in order for there to be freedom. And in talking to a spouse, a lot of times I will say, your spouse has hurt you, and your spouse is not responsible for all your hurts. And if we can allow the healing to occur in our relationship, in our marriage, and then take responsibility for the hurt that predates our spouse, then we can begin to really experience freedom. The next one that we see is that we're going to identify and own our own individual coping. So one, how would you define coping or addiction, and what does it mean to really own that?
Well, around here we talk about coping as unhealthy behavior, ways that we step outside of ourselves in our relationship. And so these are things that I do that are not, they're my ways of medicating pain that I have. And so identify, for me, one of them was busyness. And I could get super busy with children, parenting, my to-do list, and I could feel nothing doing that.
Right.
Yeah.
And that was one of my happy places,
Right,
actually.
absolutely. Well, and coping is something that we do to distract us from our reality. That when reality is too painful or difficult or challenging, then we want to exit that. And coping can be the things that we do that seem to have little or no negative consequences. And yet, anytime we step outside of our reality, we're creating more chaos. And then, obviously, for the men that we work with, their coping has moved beyond something that is benign to something that has been incredibly destructive and has become addictive for them.
I think what's important to remember, too, is that we all have coping strategies, certain behaviors or substances that help us comfort ourselves. And it's true, we get very focused on the sexual acting out in the beginning of that crash and burn or explosion or whatever we call that, because it is such a hurtful coping mechanism. The truth is, though, I'm sure you work with men about any number of other coping mechanisms. Maybe it's TV or alcohol or work or food, just as we begin as wives to look at what our coping is. Because I think it's true what you said, Susie, whenever we're choosing coping, it pulls us out of relationships. So if what we want is to create more intimacy and with another person, whether it's our spouse or anyone for that matter, and we're falling into places where we're choosing a coping to manage something in our life, we're getting less of relationship. And so we don't want to sabotage the very thing we want. And if we're not going to do that, we need to understand what we are doing. And again, this is kind of more about stage 2. It's after we've had a chance to feel the pain of how we've been hurt. And are we wanting to grow, in some new ways, perhaps that we've never even looked at? I never identified my withdrawing, over parenting, working as necessarily anything at all. It was just who I was, And I think until recovery, when I could name it and then start seeing when it showed up and then started deciding when I wanted to choose something healthier than that, did that start to make a difference too in how Mark and I grew closer?
Right.
He was working on his coping, I was working on mine. It allowed us both to kind of move in towards the relationship.
And I think sometimes there is this healthy coping where we're intentionally, reality is difficult, reality is overwhelming, so we're intentionally setting reality aside for a second and investing in a dinner or investing in a TV show, but we do that knowing that we will come back to it.
Right.
That, the thing about destructive coping is there's an unconscious belief that this will rescue us. Versus in a healthy way, we can acknowledge that, for an hour, I want to watch my favorite show, and whatever is true about my life before I watch the show will be true when the show is over. But I can temporarily step outside just to get some reprieve. And sometimes it's reading a book or just other things that we can do. But what we're talking about here is, like you're saying, these are unhealthy strategies that we want to use to exit reality and want to rescue us in some way from all that is going on. So it makes sense then that this ownership piece is important. So what does it look like for someone to really own their coping strategies?
Well, I would say, it's putting words to what we're doing so that it validates another person's reality. If Mark and I were in a situation where I got sad about something or mad about something, and my typical way of managing that might be to withdraw and not talk for a long period of time, I think as I get better at owning that, I might say to him, it's obvious that something's upsetting me here, and I'm tending to want to shut down and not talk with you. I'm just committed to figuring what this is so I can come back and talk with you in a better way. So when we own something, we're putting words to what we're doing, and we're describing who we are, and even owning the fact that what we're doing we don't like, and we're working on changing that even. We could say, I hate that about myself, that I keep doing that, but it's such an autopilot place that I learned a long time ago that I have to really practice doing something different.
Well, and that ownership is is important in the coupleship, because ownership creates safety. If we're able to own what is it that we're doing, then we can change what we're doing. I often say that you can't steward something you don't own. You can't change something you're not responsible for. So if I will own I'm coping and exiting with watching TV or eating food, then like you said, I can acknowledge I don't like that this is a part of my life. I don't even fully understand why I'm doing it, and I'm committed to figuring it out. That awareness helps to create safety in the relationship.
I'm thinking of two things, self-awareness and safety. Debbie touched on that, but we have to first become aware ourselves that maybe this isn't just who I am, and a healthy thing like proud that I'm a perfectionist or proud that I'm efficient or whatever. Self-awareness that while some of that stuff is good, there's also some downside in relationship to that. And then I have to feel safe enough to begin to own things as well.
And if we carry out that theme a little bit further, it's because if we start sharing and are vulnerable about things we're owning, it gives another person ammunition almost to use it against us if they're not a safe person.
Yeah.
So ownership is about me speaking about myself, not setting myself up so another person can say, well, I notice you're doing this again.
Right.
And, that's not creating safety in the relationship or a desire to talk about anything because we don't want it to be used against us.
Well, and in our relationships where our perception is our spouse is bugging us about something, you're watching too much TV or you're drinking too much, or when we are able to take responsibility for that and own, hey, I want you to know I'm aware that I'm watching a lot of TV, then they are free not to send us that message because we already have that message. And so the more that we can own, we're kind of releasing our spouse from needing to watch over us in order for their safety. We create safety for them, and we contribute to their safety by simply owning the coping strategies that we have.
I think it's kind of interesting if you watch your relationship, and if you're in one where you find you're being criticized a lot by a partner, you might take a look at whether you're not doing much owning yourself. I mean, I'm not saying it's always that way, but it can be.
Right.
Where when you're not owning enough things, it's understandable why somebody else is noticing the things that maybe they would like for you to change that would be better for you. And it comes out as criticism, really. There can be other reasons too, but I'm just saying,
Right.
if you want to just be a gentle observer of yourself and that dynamic, just see how that is for you.
Well, see, the next thing there in the stage 2 is we start to practice stating our needs. And this seems like such a subtle thing, and yet I do think it is foundational to developing a healthy way of being in relationship with other people. So what is the significance of being able to state your needs?
Well, I think it allows us to be congruent, mostly. When we don't state our needs, because we believe here that we all do have needs and desires. It's also true that we've all learned different things about needs and desires as we've been growing up. Some of us, I just talked with a woman yesterday, in fact, who said, I never really in my family was allowed to have my own needs. My dad was a very angry person. We knew we needed to be careful and attend to his needs. And my mom was just too busy to really listen to any of my needs. And even today, when you ask me what I need, I don't even know how to answer that question. But because we believe we all have needs, when we're able to state them, it gives another person we're around really a gift of not having to figure us out.
Right.
And I think many of us live with a belief that if I know you well or if I love you because you're married to me, you ought to just know what I need.
Right.
And we've learned we're not mind readers. And so that isn't one of the elements of loving a person, is being able to figure them all out without them talking for themselves.
Well, and the way that I talk about addiction is when we try to meet a legitimate need in an illegitimate way in a repetitive pattern. And recovery is identifying the legitimate need and then meeting the legitimate need in a legitimate way. So the foundational principle of recovery is going to be understanding what my needs are and being able to meet them and share them with my spouse. And it's interesting that for a lot of people, to express a need is perceived as being selfish. And yet the reality is, we do believe that everyone is needful. If I can be clear about my needs, that doesn't mean my spouse has to meet them, but I'm at least acknowledging that there's something that I'm aware of that is creating a vulnerability that I need to pay attention to.
I think this is a place where our early story always comes into play. And I'm impressed by the number of subtle, normal reasons why we're not in touch with our needs. We grow up in a healthy family that, whatever. I just find it to be so common that people aren't used to figuring out needs. It was a really difficult thing for me, and it isn't a blatant you have a horrible story so you can't figure out your needs. It just is a really common and normal thing. We learn various ways it's selfish. In the church we learn to serve others, and there's just all kinds of limitless reasons why I think we come into recovery and we need some growth in this area.
Well, and that's a great transition to the next thing, is this idea of we begin to identify our distorted core beliefs.
Yeah.
And I talk about core beliefs at the workshop, that a core belief is a belief that is so central to who you are, it shapes and forms the decisions that you make. And so these are many times operating at this unconscious level, but they manifest themselves in these decisions. So very much like you were saying, Susie, maybe I was taught that to have a need is to be selfish, or that my needs don't matter. I'm not even conscious of that, but it limits my ability to talk about them. But we have core beliefs in all aspects of our life.
Yes, about ourselves, about other people, and about the world, and about God. So I think one of the most fascinating things about counseling is getting connected to thinking about what we believe. And in fact, I told someone one time, I think if we were to kind of dumb down the whole process of counseling, it really is to understand and be able to identify what our beliefs are and which one of those we want to keep and which ones are outdated, and we want to get rid of those and replace them with what's true.
Right.
So I think as we're growing up, all of our experiences in life lead to some kind of belief. I was just sharing with you yesterday, I think, when we were talking about being a twin, being born a twin. And I know one of my beliefs growing up, we were not identical, so we had kind of individual personalities, and certainly we did not look alike. But my belief as a young girl was just that my sister, Barb, was always prettier than I was more athletic than I was more social than I was really just a more acceptable person, a more chosen person. And I never talked to anybody about that. I didn't talk to my parents about it. I just knew that it created pain inside of me and loneliness at times when I perceived her to be chosen for so many things. But that core belief lived with me really until recovery. And then when Mark's information came out, it just validated for me that my core belief was probably true.
Right.
Because I wasn't so choosable for him either, was my belief. But what's true is counseling led to really living in what was true. And learning about addiction taught me what was really true about his behavior, and that it wasn't about me. And that I also learned that my beliefs about my sister weren't true either. In fact,
Right.
we had an adult conversation, and she said to me, well, that's really funny because I felt the same way about you.
Right.
And so here we both lived all these years having some of these same beliefs inside that really had become outdated. We needed to get them out of the shelf. You know, those old cans of food are
Right.
5-10 years old
Their
before you throw
expiration
them out.
dates.
Yeah, a lot of expiration dates. And so I think counseling is a lot about getting rid of the expired dates on these beliefs.
Well, and I think also this idea, I teach that our early experience create the core beliefs, and then very much like you said, the core beliefs become a filter through which we then begin to interpret our experiences. And we don't recognize them. They are unconscious, they are subtle, and yet they are very formative in the way that I do relationship, the way that I do life. And many times the best way to identify a core belief is that if somebody asks you, why did you do something, or why did you respond in that way, instead of hearing it as an accusation or a shaming message, to just hear it as an invitation and ask, well, I wonder why I did do that. And many times a driving factor will be our core beliefs.
Absolutely.
I think it's easy for us to present this and make that sound like an easy process.
Oh, yeah.
And I just
Yes.
want to be here to say it's
The voice of reason.
the confusion that I know I have felt. I hear that all the time from clients. I just feel so confused. I just feel so. We're re-examining much of what we came to believe as the way the world works, often in recovery. And so if our listeners feel confused, we can tell them they're normal.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that's a great point, Susie. A lot of times we have a conversation about something and we can leave the listener believing that there's this simple process, step 1, step 2, but self-exploration is very complex. And there is a part of us that is resistant to it. And we do need help and support. And that's the beauty of community, because through their reactions, their conversations, their just being with us, it can create the direction that we need to discover some of these things.
And I would add that when someone tells me they feel confused, I let them know that that's a good thing.
Right.
Because confusion to me tells me that they are now wrestling with several different beliefs. And they are hopefully in their exploration going to decide where they're going to land. And so confusion doesn't need to be a bad emotion. It can be one that reminds us we're on some kind of a journey here to update our belief system. So take all the time you need. Talk to people.
Right.
Let it, just sit in you for a while. And when you land on the truth, you'll know that as
Right.
well. It won't be as confusing.
I often say that I think sometimes working with Christians are one of the most difficult groups to work with, because a Christian will tell you what they're supposed to believe or what they've been taught to believe versus what deeper down they actually believe. But if someone feels safe enough to really go down and explore not what am I supposed to believe, but what do I actually believe, then as you've identified, Debbie, I have an opportunity to get free from that and not be defined by that anymore. Well, the next thing that we're going to be talking about is this: explore how personal trauma affects the relationship. And, we have some awareness that our histories, our stories, we bring those into the coupleship. What does it look like for someone to really begin to understand how their own personal pain is influencing how they relate to their friends, their couple, in the coupleship, etc.?
I think coming into recovery, and especially being part of groups, is helpful here, because we come in and we have our idea of normal. And the way I grew up is my idea of normal, and others as well. And so exploring, opening possibilities of well, maybe that was hurtful to you, that you were asked to take on such heavy responsibility at such a young age, or it can help open our eyes to things that created beliefs for us. That's not the same as blatant trauma,
Right.
serious abuse or whatever, but it does create our beliefs. It does form us. And so that's the first thing I think of is the value of group, safe community to explore that.
Well, it gives us the capacity to see our story through a new lens. And we many times need other people's reactions to right size our experience. And, it's not catastrophizing what I experienced, and it's not minimizing what I experienced. And for a lot of people, the word trauma is triggering, and trauma always means anything worse than what I experienced. We can minimize what we've gone through because from our perspective, it wasn't that bad. And one of the ways that we survived it as a child was telling ourselves it wasn't that bad. And so if the word trauma is kind of throwing you off, then simply talk about what are the injuries I experienced, what were the painful things, what were my wounds, whatever extent they were, and somehow they're informing and influencing my relationship.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, Greg, because I think the word trauma here can be a little misleading in that I know for me too, I didn't grow up with a lot of traumatic things happening to me, actually not at all. And yet all of life influenced me in terms of what I believed about myself, others in the world. And it did lead me to live life in a certain way and to be triggered by certain things. So like you said, Susie, I think actually some of us who've had a calmer, safer life in our own families have a harder time accessing what some of those things are that have influenced us. And so the exploration process continues, but I don't think it's just for those who have had tremendous abusive kind of trauma in their life. What we're finding is it could be just as much about things that didn't happen to you. I'm not talking about bad things, but things you weren't experiencing in your life, like being affirmed and heard and understood and safe and included and all those desires we talk about that actually also created belief systems for yourself and ways of living. So.
And I think it also opens eyes to things that actually were abusive, that somebody maybe thought was just normal.
Right. Good. Well, I hate to say it, but we've come to the end of our time. There's so much more that we could say about this. But again, we're just talking about the stages that people go through their own couples development. And so I hope that you'll join us next week as we continue the conversation about the stages of growth for couples. And I'm glad that you've been with us this week.
Yeah, and Susie, thanks for joining us. It's really a joy to have you with us on the podcast.
Happy to be here.
And Deb, as always, it's just a blessing for us to have you share your thoughts and experiences with us. So until next week, we'd like to invite you to continue to look at the Faithful and True YouTube channel. Like us after you watch our podcasts. We appreciate that. You can continue to listen to the audio versions of our podcast at iTunes and iHeartRadio, as well as the faithfulandtrue.com website. So until next time, I'm Randy Everett, your co-host. Dr. Greg Miller, our host, and we thank you for joining us. May this week be a week for you that's filled with many blessings and great vision.